Hi, and welcome to my presentation about Hitler's adolescence through the approach of Bronfenbrenner. I'd like to preface my presentation by explaining a little bit why I chose Hitler as my famous person to research. I am a German teacher, and of course Hitler is very famous throughout all of Europe, and I would say all over the world. Of course, my students know of him as well. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at his adolescence, which I knew relatively little about, through this psychological approach to hopefully shed some light on some factors that may have contributed to the man that Hitler became and why he ended up becoming what many people would call a madman or a monster. So with that in mind, welcome. So I'd like to start off with a little bit of biographical information about Adolf Hitler. He was born in 1889 in Braunau in Austria, and here you can see a picture of him as a young child, along with the area in Austria where he was born, and of course then a picture from his role as Der Führer, as the leader of the Third Reich in Germany, later in his adulthood. And I would argue that the picture on the left is one that no one would recognize, and yet the picture on the right is a picture that evokes many, many responses, negative responses from people all over the world. He is undoubtedly the most famous leader in modern history, and our American culture perpetuates his really incredible and unlikely path to power as the dictator of Germany, starting in 1932. We have a lot of movies and media that keep his legacy alive. Of course, Hitler is known as the anti-Semitic Nazi who led Germany to the Second World War and later the Holocaust, which was the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews. And as we all know, he died in 1945. The conclusion was that he died by suicide. And in this paper, we will look at his adolescence and some details about his family and some things that may have led him to start out as an innocent child, but then to end up as a very malicious leader. So a little bit about the psychological theory that we are using to analyze his adolescence is Bronfenbrenner's PPCT theory, or his theory is the bioecological theory of human development. And here is a picture of Bronfenbrenner. I was very curious to learn a little bit more about him. He was a Russian-American developmental psychologist. And we're going to look in this paper at the 4 parts of the PPCT theory, which stands for process, person, context, and time. Bronfenbrenner's theory is ecological, stressing person, context, interrelatedness. And so we will be looking at each of these as we look at Hitler's adolescence. So first we look at process, which is the first P in Bronfenbrenner's theory, which is the regular interaction between persons in one's immediate environment. Obviously, this incorporates the family. And actually, there's not a whole lot of credible information about Hitler's family, but I can tell you a little bit about his parents. His father, Alois Hitler, was a mid-level customs official in Austria, and he was 51 when Adolf was born. He very much wanted Adolf to follow in his footsteps, but Adolf was interested in art and wanted to become an artist. His father rejected that idea and never really accepted Adolf. He was demanding and authoritarian. And he and Adolf got in engaged in many bitter arguments together, which often led to physical abuse and, of course, emotional abuse. So his relationship with his father was not very good. On the other hand, his mother, Clara Hitler, was considered to be warm, quite the opposite of his father, loving and in some ways indulgent or permissive. She always would help Adolf feel better after enduring these bitter altercations with his dad. We know a little tiny bit about Hitler's siblings. There isn't a whole lot out there also about them, but there were 6 Hitler children, and Clara was said to be Aloy's third wife, actually. And out of the 6 children, only Adolf and his sister survived into adulthood. He did have a younger brother who unfortunately died when Adolf was only 11, so he was really only left with one sibling, his sister, and there's not a whole lot of information about her, although they are said to have had an okay relationship. So as I already mentioned, Adolf lost his younger brother when he was just 11 years old, which really took a toll on his mental and emotional state. It was said that after his brother died, he became detached and introverted and was deeply depressed by this. His father then also passed away relatively suddenly when he was 14. And then he lost his mother when he was 18 to breast cancer, and that loss also in particular was devastating to Adolf, as he was very close to his mother. She seemed to be really his support system in his family or anywhere else. So after these tragic events, particularly in secondary school, he became psychologically withdrawn. He didn't have many friends. His academic performance declined. It was said that he was in primary school actually clever and popular, is how he was called. But obviously that changed after these tragic losses in his life. He didn't have any motivation anymore and no one really to push him. And then he dropped out of school when he was 16 without a formal education qualification. Although Adolf's father, Alois, rejected his artistic passions and talents, he always fought and never gave up his hope to become an artist. So after his father died, his mother did not stand in his way anymore to allow him to pursue his dreams. And so he actually moved to Vienna and applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, but he was rejected entrance because he lacked the educational qualifications. So this was yet another blow to his developing sense of self and, you know, his autonomy to make his own decisions and follow his dreams. So now we're at the person, the second P in Bronfenbrenner's PPCT theory. And here we're looking at demand characteristics. We know that Adolf was a white male with brown hair and blue eyes, and he was of average height. There's nothing really extraordinary about his physical characteristics. The picture here is showing his trademark toothbrush mustache, but that did not appear until later in his adulthood. The resource characteristics of Adolf Hitler we can break down into a few different categories. He had strong mental resources, but it seems that he didn't really apply them during his middle and late adolescence due to the depression of losing his loved ones. Again, his emotional resources were drained due to the loss of his mother and younger brother. He endured emotional and physical abuse from his father and lacked social support. So his emotional resources were very drained throughout his adolescence, increasingly as he got older. Social resources, we know that he had very limited friends and isolated himself from his peers, particularly in middle and late adolescence. Material resources were adequate until after his mother passed away when he was on his own, and I'll talk about that a little coming up. After Hitler was rejected from the Fine Arts Academy in Vienna, he stayed there for a while, but the issues were that his material resources were pretty much non-existent. He had no educational qualifications to help him get a good job, no regular income, no career, and he was actually homeless for a while, working as a starving artist in Vienna, so he had no place to call home. The force characteristics of Hitler are quite interesting. We will look at temperament, motivation, and persistence here according to Bronfenbrenner's theory. Some of the characteristics we have to glean from his adulthood, because I think it appears that the depression and sadness of his adolescence kind of overshadowed some of these things that he didn't express, or couldn't, rather. Temperament, we know that he was passionate, strong-willed, and charismatic. Motivation, we know it was lacking after the death of his brother and mother, and after he was rejected from the Academy of Arts, he eventually gave up on art and chose a new path, eventually joining the German army. And persistence, I think he showed to be a very persistent person. Despite many setbacks, he did persevere to find a successful career in military and politics later in his late adolescence and early adulthood. An interesting note here is that psychologists in the past, since his death, have done some research trying to pinpoint whether or not Hitler was a victim of mental illness, and there is some evidence based on this research that he may have been a paranoid schizophrenic. And some of the reasons that are pointed to are his preoccupations with delusions of persecution from his disapproving father, those unwilling to recognize his talents, and Jewish protagonist. He also had early dysfunction, academic, personal, and occupational, and all of these factors lead to researchers to feel that he may have suffered from mental illness. It's pretty impossible now that he's gone to know for sure, but there has been much speculation about this. So now we look at the context, which is the C of the PPCT theory, which includes the microsystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem. So first, the microsystem would have been Hitler's family and friends. We know that he had a turbulent relationship with his father, but a close relationship with his mother, and we're not too sure about his sibling relationships, although we know that he was devastated by his brother's death. Friends, there's no record of close friendships with peers or anyone outside his family, and also no romantic relationships until later in his life. For the exosystem, his father's career did have an effect on Adolf because he wanted him to follow in his footsteps, but was rejected because he wanted to pursue art and his father was not approving. In regard to the macrosystem, this is probably one of the biggest influences on Adolf Hitler's journey from late adolescence into his adulthood. The cultural influences of the pre-World War I period in Austria and Germany, along with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 1800s. These things most definitely had an impact on his development later in his adolescence, which began around the time that he moved to Vienna. The final component in Bronfenbrenner's theory is time, micro, meso, and macro time. So first, the meso time could be seen here as the constant conflict that he had with his father, something that was a regular occurrence until his father passed away, and certainly had an effect on Hitler's sense of self. The macro time is most applicable to Hitler's adolescence, especially in the later years, as the political influences he started to pick up in Vienna are believed to be the beginning of his anti-Semitic values. Along with the pre-World War I time in history, was also influential and certainly had a role in his future. Just a note of a few other considerations of different things we can consider outside of the direct PPCT theory, perhaps Sigmund Freud would have said that Hitler had an Oedipus complex, the desire to eliminate his father. Another consideration is all the idiosyncratic transitions that Adolf experienced, such as the death of his father, mother, and brother during his adolescence. Finally, we can conclude with parenting styles and the effect of parenting styles on self-esteem. We know that Hitler's father was authoritarian, that his mother was more permissive, and both of these parenting styles contribute to a lack of psychosocial maturity and competence. We know that self-esteem is related to parental approval and peer support and success in school. Clearly, these are areas that Hitler struggled in and had a very low self-esteem. In conclusion, we can conclude, based on the research and data that is available about Hitler's adolescence, while it is much more limited than the research and information available about his adulthood, we can easily say that Hitler's tumultuous adolescence, conflicts with his father, the death of his loved ones, his lack of social groups, his geographic location, and the cultural influences of his time were all central roles in influencing his life course. We can also consider the possibility of mental illness. This analysis has led me to question that if any of these factors that we looked at through Bronfenbrenner's PPCT theory had been different, would Hitler's name still carry the sad legacy that it does today? And from analyzing his life with the knowledge that we have, we can utilize the psychological concepts of various theories to hope to better understand factors that influence malicious behavior and attempt to prevent atrocities like the Holocaust from happening again. Thank you for listening.